Hi, everybody. Can you hear me at the back? Is that all right? Ooh, thumbs up. Excellent. OK, great. Hi, everybody. My name is Pam Dingle, and I work for Ping. I am moderating this session, and I'm also the first speaker, which means that I have total control. Before I start, I want to introduce the other people in the track, because with this track, it's going to be very holistic. So we've each sort of split up some subjects, but we're all longtime veterans of the industry, and we all have comments. So there'll probably be quite a bit of back and forth. So I'm going to introduce everyone now, and then I'll do it again at the next session, because people will probably be coming and going. So bit of history. My name is Pam Dingle. My background is in directories, email servers, middleware, and web access management type of installations as a consultant before I joined Ping Identity to work in their CTO office, where I do a lot of work on standards, emerging standards, prototypes, and also vision and strategy for the company. I'd also like to introduce, we'll go in order of presentation. This is Dale Olds here. Stand up. There we go. Wait. There we go. See? It's interactive.
I just do whatever Pam says.
That's right. Dale Olds runs you run the team, yes? The Horizon team at VMware.
The identity portion.
The identity side of the Horizon project at VMware. And I met Dale years and years ago on a project called the Bandit Project, which was information cards. How many people here have ever heard of information cards? Yeah, all right, that's pretty good. That's not bad. It was doomed. You want to talk about doomed and dead? That's doomed and dead. And I'd like to also introduce Gil Kirkpatrick. Stand up and wave.
Yes, mistress.
See, he knows how it goes. So Gil is here from ViewDS, and he's going to be talking about XACTML. And I first met Gil at a conference called, at the time, the Directory Experts Conference. And he, in fact, ran the conference, and he gave me my first chance to speak on a stage. And so I am always eternally grateful, and he's a great mentor. So if you ever have any questions, he's also an Active Directory guru. He's got 25 years of Active Directory experience. So
Can't be that long. No?
I don't know, lots. We'll say lots.
Okay, lots
is good. Lots is good. Yeah. Okay, so now let's get started on this and see what we're going to talk about. All right, so this is all about baking. This is all about preparation and all about essentially designing an outcome for your enterprise. So there's a few things that we need to talk about during that. We clearly have some platitudes that we're going to have to cover, because that's where you get all the cool pictures in, and that's important. And we have to talk about why we're here, and then we have to talk about what we want to achieve and how we're going to achieve it. My section is identity. So I will not be talking about authentication. I will not be talking about authorization. I will not even be talking about governance. I'm really talking about data that runs identity, where it sits, why it sits there, how to get it there, and how quickly to get it there, if you will. So first of all, the heckler policy. Okay, what we're here to do, and so that everybody in the audience understands this, what we're here to do is to talk about the big picture of identity. So basic recipes for identity. We are not here to rat hole down into a tiny little aspect of one protocol's, the way you can get an LDIF interchange format to upload if you happen to be, on an AS400. Okay, that's not why we're here. So,
It'd be interesting, though.
Yeah, we could have a different session on that. However, what we are here to do is share experience. So everyone in this room, there are going to be people who are brand new to identity, and there are going to be people who have lived in the trenches and have war stories and can really enrich the lives of other people in this room. So if you have a story you want to tell, or if you want to talk about that big picture, jump in. Ask questions. The more interactive this is, the more everybody learns. We did this last year, and it was a boatload of fun. We had lots of people, volunteering experience and adding to what have to really, necessarily be a fairly bare bones, high-level flyby. So jump in, object if you think that something is wrong, and and we'll go from there. But if you try to rat hole, we'll drag you out. You'll be chopped. All right, so to the actual real stuff. I can't stand up here anymore. So the real stuff, so managing identities, well, what does that mean? To me, there are two very specific types of activities you have to do in an identity management department or organization, right? You have to set everything up and prepare it ahead of time. And then you have to leverage what you prepare at runtime. So there are the systems that you have to do every day, regardless of whether those systems are used, whether the data is used. You just have to push data to the right places. You have to get the right information into the right application databases. And you have to do all of that without ever knowing if it's going to be used or when it's going to be used, so that the second it does have to be used, all of the data in that application database is relevant, it's accurate, it's concise, and that runtime, spur-of-the-moment decision that actually enables people to be productive and enables security to work and protect assets. All of that stuff just works as long as you've been managing your identities all along in a reliable, consistent fashion. So bottom line, you have to know what you're doing in the first place. You can't just start pushing data around, right? You can't not know what applications are in your enterprise. You have to know what you're trying to do in the first place, and then you have to make sure that you have all the right pieces to make all of those applications and make all of those databases accurate and relevant. So that's essentially what we're here to do. That's my version of an identity souffle. So preparation, right? It's very close to double ledger accounting. You have to know who's in every single system that you have. You have to know why they're in that system. You have to know when they should be out of that system. You have to know what things can change in that system and are volatile. You also have to know what things never leave that system, right? Because there's a ton of data that is only ever specific to a local context, right? Just because you're not moving around doesn't mean that you don't have to know it's there. And remember, this is the platitudes section, so we'll get more concrete about this shortly. But the bottom line is, if you have not created essentially a state machine for the movement of corporate information in your enterprise, if you don't have that state machine of people being onboarded, people being terminated, roles changing, and systems being informed when all of these different state changes take place, then number 2 on this list of leveraging that state is just not even possible. And most importantly, if you get it wrong, it's wrong. There's no, you can design the best security regime in the entire world. It can have bells, it can have whistles. But if somebody is in that database and active, when they shouldn't be in that database and active, then your security decisions are not going to be accurate, right? You have to make security decisions based on real, live, useful data that represents the state of your enterprise at that moment. Garbage in, garbage out. So in some ways, identity management is the least glamorous of everything in the identity world, right? I mean, you're moving data, you're copying things, you've got a lot of workflows, you've got a lot of databases, but it is the absolute foundation for everything you do. In any, so many of the operations of your company rely on the data that whoever is working in identity management is pushing through the enterprise. All right, so that's it for the platitudes, right? Garbage in, garbage out. I comes before I am. It's very true. But here's what we're actually trying to do. Now, I don't know if you can read all this. It looks much smaller here than I expected. But bottom line is, if you're going to run an identity management regime, you may only be responsible for the identity side, but you have to understand all the pieces of the entire identity architecture. So let me just read this to you. So the blue one here is identity management, right? So that's really the piece that we're talking about in this first hour. Directory services, right? second piece we're talking about in this hour. But there's all these other puzzle pieces that fit and have to fit together, and you have to know what they are, because all of these other guys, access management, credential management, federation, audit, government, governance, and intelligence, all of that infrastructure depends on the data you're moving to. So if you don't know how those pieces work, then how can you possibly get the attributes and other identity information in place, not to mention policy, in place for all of those other pieces to work? So I love this. This is Dan Hedrick from GE made this. Yeah, and I think it's absolutely wonderful to just have a full picture of why we're here, what we're trying to do, right? So when I say know what we're trying to do, this is what we're trying to do. This is the infrastructure side. And then there's all the pieces that revolve around this, right, which are your satellite applications, your line of business applications, right, of people who don't care about identity. They don't care about security. They don't want to care. They want you to care for them by building this infrastructure and making it accurate, and abstracting it away from them so that they can just rely on your identity management infrastructure rather than from on having to make their own little isolated decisions. All right, so does anyone see anything missing from this picture? If you're running your own identity management regime, what else would you add? So there's nothing in here about mobile right now. Nothing in here about mobile. There's nothing in here about APIs, right? So maybe you could call that covered under federation, but probably not, right? So this is only growing as people's infrastructures are starting to merge, right? So you've got federation here, but you've got security token services there. So you could say that security token services are going to protect your APIs, but you still have to start thinking about how are your APIs leveraging identity? What data stores are there for those APIs? So this is the map, but it's a growing map, and things are literally changing under us as we evolve. Even between last year and this year at CIS, there are sort of new fancy things evolving. All right. So the term you're going to hear a lot is identity lifecycle. And the way I think of identity lifecycle is like a clothesline, right? When a user comes into a relationship with your enterprise, you're pinning them up on the clothesline. And then over time, they're reeling out, right? They're reeling out, they're dipping along on the clothesline, and all of a sudden, that relationship is over, and they get ripped off the clothesline, right? But the entire time they have that relationship, the relationship may change, right? Or it may disappear altogether. But ultimately, if you're doing your job well in identity management, you're managing that clothesline. And you're ensuring that the person goes up on that clothesline in time, the right time. They're coming off of the clothesline at the right time. And this is, it sounds really easy when you describe it like that. It's actually really hard. So how many people, when they started their current job, had access to all the applications they needed the first day that they started? Okay, all right, a few. So that problem, right? That problem of hiring somebody and having them be useless for days or weeks, right? That has a direct return on investment to the companies that you work for, right? Every day that somebody can't do their job is a day that their identity management is failing, right? So we're going to talk about provisioning. We're going to talk about getting people into those systems. And then we're going to talk about what it means to utilize the provision data for authentication and authorization. There are some really nasty stories. I'm sure people here have some really nasty stories about what happens when identity management goes wrong. My favorite one was I was doing some work for a pipeline company, and they were in a panic because they had done their SOX audit. They've done their attestation, and they had gone, you have to identify your critical systems, and then you have to go through and say who has access to those critical systems. And they luckily went through in advance before the auditors showed up, and they found dead people in the list, right? you should never find dead people in your access control list. If there's ever a high-level guide to life, dead people should never be in your systems. So those are the kinds of things that can happen. The other one, if you're a funeral home, yes, but even then, those people are the objects, not the subjects. So I'll even argue with that. Now, if it was the zombie apocalypse, okay, and the zombies needed access, then all right, I'll buy that. But the other one that really drives, so a lot of identity management is driven by fear, really, fear, because there's risk involved in having misaligned systems. Every time you have someone in a system and with access that doesn't need it, you have a risk of abuse. Every time you have somebody who isn't in a system but should be, then your risk is that you're losing productivity, right? And that user's sitting twiddling their thumbs when they could be creating value for the company. So when you define all of this stuff in terms of risk, the really scary one right now is cloud. Because it used to be that, so the thing about on-premise identity management is you can cheat. You can cheat 50 ways in on-premise identity management because essentially it's a soft, gooey middle and a crunchy outside as far as your network goes. So in on-premise identity, if you terminate someone, you can take away their key card and you can take away their network access, right? And they could have access to hundreds of internal applications, but they probably can't get to them, right? So you can basically take 2 actions and mitigate your risk, right? So it's still not nice, it's still messy, it would still fail a SOX audit, but you're probably not gonna actually find that there's sabotage that goes on, for example. However, in a cloud situation, that's not the case. So you could fire somebody, you could take away their network access, take away their card key, and if they're password authenticating to cloud applications, they can go to any other network location, right? Walk across the street to Starbucks, sit down, log in to Salesforce or Concur or any number of smaller cloud applications, and they can download things, they can manipulate them. They could just keep their accounts active and just log in every other day, see what the company's doing, perhaps give that information to their new employer, right? So as soon as you've lost that ability to cheat by shutting down the network, you put yourself up for much, much greater risk. So this is sort of the fear component of failing at identity management. Okay, so I'm going to get into some terms. How are we doing for time? You didn't press the start button.
Oh, you're right, I didn't.
Well, now we don't even know how long we're going for. Sorry. You just going to go by time? 30 plus minutes, all right, that's good. So let's just talk about the units, right? So right now we're still talking at a very high level. We're talking about information, but we're really not defining it. If you're going to run an identity management infrastructure, you need to know the units. And these are the basic units that you have to understand. Accounts, identifiers, and attributes. So an account, the best definition I've seen of an account is a relationship between a user and a system. Okay, so it's not that it's a record in a database. It's not that it's an LDAP entry. It's that there's a relationship there. And the very existence of an account means that relationship exists. Take away the account, you take away the relationship. Now, generally, accounts also act as containers and contain information about the user, right? They're very often used to populate sessions, right? They can contain personalization data. They can contain authorization settings, roles. There's lots of things that an account can create. But the actual presence of an account is a piece of information in and of itself. Accounts are affiliated with identifiers. Okay, sometimes one identifier, sometimes many identifiers. Okay, the identifier is the handle by which you can uniquely identify the account. Examples of these kinds of identifiers, and multiple identifiers. Active Directory is a perfect example of this. In Active Directory, you have at least 4 or 5. There you go. I don't even know what the 5th one is. So you've got an object GUID, you've got a SAM account name, which is essentially a username. You've got, well, an email address, which is often uniquely identified.
Okay, user principal name.
User principal name and the SID.
And the distinguished name.
And oh, yeah, that's right, and the distinguished name. So all of those things, all of those types of attributes have the special property of being identifiers. And all of them are used for different things, right? So some identifiers are used by humans, which generally means they have to be shorter, right? And have some kind of mnemonic value to them so that people don't, so their heads don't explode when they try to use them. Others of them can be big, long, nasty numbers, and they're basically being used by systems to, as a primary index, a database index, if you will, to refer to the account. Anything else you guys want to talk about identifiers? All right. Yeah, we'll talk a bit more about them after, because they're probably one of the top 5 things you have to get right in identity management. The last one is an attribute. How many people here would say that attributes and claims are the same thing? Does anyone? Nobody? Oh, man. All right, well, I think they're the same thing. They are, thank you. They are distinct pieces of information, right? So they are units of information that have names and can be referenced by name, right? So first name, last name, email address, right? They don't have to be simple strings. They can be complex information. So for example, your postal address could actually be a composite attribute containing a whole bunch of sub-attributes like your street address and your postal code and all of those other things. Okay, so when we talk about attributes, we're basically talking about something you can give a name and hold up and say, this is the value of this attribute, right? And then what we get to do is we get to move and trade and transform attributes based on business policy and business logic. Yes?
So there's another aspect of attributes too, is attributes aren't just about users. So it's not like, users have attributes and there are no other attributes. But resources have attributes as well too. So they might have a risk value associated with them, or they might have some sort of sensitivity or any kind of interesting information that you might make authorization decisions with. So it's not just user attributes, it's user resource attributes, and then there are other attributes that are useful in identity management as well.
Right. And I think I'm going to just skip right back. We might as well just dive right into attributes. So let's talk about attributes, right? What's the difference between packaging that says something's gluten-free and packaging that says something is certified gluten-free? Right? The only difference is, in theory, the person who made the certified gluten-free label is willing to stand up and say, I say it's gluten-free and I can prove it in this way. Right? So attributes have assurance, right, affiliated with them. And sometimes it doesn't matter if there's a lot of assurance associated with an attribute. Sometimes it really matters. Right? So if somebody's going to say that your credit score is abysmal, wouldn't it be great if you could actually have some kind of accountability, right, back to the person who made that claim? Well, it doesn't happen today in our real world, right? Sort of silent entities can make claims about our credit scores, for example, and we really have no remediation. But in the corporate world, it's a different thing, right? So in the corporate world, if there's something that absolutely has to be a verified attribute, you should be able to trace it back and ask for an authoritative source to say, yes, I know it's this value because of X. I can prove that this is a value. The other piece is self-asserted attributes. So self-asserted attributes are everywhere. They are the basis of commerce, right, in our identity systems. When you apply for a bank loan and you fill in the form with your name and your address and all that, you are self-asserting all of that data, right? That self-asserted data, that form you originally fill in, becomes the basis of them accepting your bank loan. It's the basis of them operating and relating to you as a business ever after, right? So knowing which data is self-asserted and which data isn't, and knowing how to trust that data is a huge part of building a business on top of identity information. So those terms are good to know, right? Self-asserted, verified. You may not have a lot of business need for them to start with, but the customers that we tend to work with, right, in the identity industry, the ones with really deep needs, they're moving beyond this concept of self-asserted and verified, they're actually starting to pull attributes from authoritative sources all over the internet, right? So I want a credit score. I'm going to call in real time to LexisNexis and pull that down, right? I want a DMV, a DMV number check. Okay, I'm going to go pull that down in real time. So this is becoming, I would say, one of the new frontiers, the emerging frontiers in enterprise. And it's been emerging for a while. People have wanted to do this for a long time, but it's really actually becoming possible now. And the last piece is perishability. This is the critical piece, right? Perishability. And we don't do this very well in enterprises today, right? Enterprises today, what happens is we take a bunch of data and we write it into a database and then we leave it and it rots, right? And it stays there for a long, long time until somebody complains, right? And then perhaps that data will change. A perfect example of this is name changes, right? So you get married, you decide you're going to take your husband's name, right? You fill in one form with HR to change your last name, and then, and I don't actually have personal experience of this, but I have friends who have really complained about this, where every time they log in, they see their maiden name, right? Every single application, everywhere, they see the old data, and the sad thing is that these applications never think to check. And really what we're talking about with provisioning is changing that, right? Writing systems that mean that the applications don't have to check because we're going to push the right data into their applications to begin with. So bottom line, we want to standardize, right? We want, in a perfect world, wouldn't it be great if the birth date stored in 50 systems was always using ISO 8601 standard, right? That would be lovely. You can't always do it. However, publishing a standard means that if application developers have a choice, they can refer to the standard and they can choose a value that works for them. I'm going to back up. So I actually skipped ahead there. Okay, so we're still talking at such a high level, right? So let's look at a concrete example of what we're talking about when we're talking about all this data. So what I've got here is an example of essentially requirements, okay, for a system. I have two things here labeled SOR, right? So SOR is system of record. And I have pink arrows and I have blue arrows, okay? What these arrows represent are relationships between data, okay? Not movement of data, but relationships. So in this requirements, we're not talking about how something's going to be done. We're talking about that it should be done, right? So some voodoo magic has to exist for the relationships in this map to happen. So let's talk about it. We've got an HR system. So we hire somebody new into the HR system, right? A name is going to magically appear, right? Maybe an administrator typed it in, right? A name is going to appear. They're going to be assigned an employee number. What should happen next? Well, by some process somewhere, when a name occurs in the HR system, an account should magically also occur in Active Directory, right? And it should have name information that is dependent on the HR system, right? It should be assigned email addresses. It should be assigned groups, okay? And as those email addresses and groups appear, now magically that data should ripple up to applications that the user has access to in the enterprise, right? So again, voodoo magic happens, and all of a sudden your internal applications know about this user, right? Because they have a valid role. And all of a sudden a database record or an account appears in your internal applications. And then more voodoo magic happens, and they end up provisioned or with an account in the cloud applications, right? This relationship map has nothing to do with how. It just has to do with what, right? As things change, where they change matters. So if an administrator goes in to this cloud app here and changes the last name of the user, what should happen? Absolutely nothing, because that is not the authoritative source for name, right? So if you change it here, then really you should get a slap on the wrist. If you're going to change that data, you should go to your single source of truth, which is your HR system. You should change it in your HR system, and then again the magic voodoo happens, right? And the data ripples through your system. Okay, this is what we're trying to do. without trying to talk about the solution behind it, right? Is have these relationships between the systems and know what those relationships are. So if you don't know all the applications in your enterprise, then you can't possibly have the ripple effects to all of your applications, bottom line. Yes?
Can I get a show of hands? How many people actually automatically provision from their HR system into Active Directory or into other applications?
Okay.
So maybe a quarter, something like that?
How many people have no automation right now in their systems as far as pushing data around? Anyone? Okay, so everyone's doing something. All right, well then, maybe we step this up a level, right? I don't want to be talking about basics if you guys have this concept pretty well down. However, I will talk about the principle, right? Single source of truth. Also, don't repeat yourself. It's kind of the mantra of identity management, right? You have to know where the data is authoritative, and you have to manage it at its authoritative source. All right, so I think we've covered the identifiers. One other thing, want to differentiate between a login identifier and a regular identifier. So a login identifier is essentially an identifier with a usability requirement. And one of the things, so I'm not talking about authentication, but one of the really interesting things that authentication does for identity management is it allows you to transform those identifiers. So you can have a user log in once at a web access management system or a federation system using a login handle that they know and understand. And behind the scenes, your authentication regime can transform that well-known identifier into an application-specific identifier that's sort of messy and ugly and that the user doesn't even need to know. So standardizing on a single login ID is a really good idea. It just makes all of your users' lives easier. Okay, we've talked about this. Move along. All right, let's talk about directories. So directories are fun. Directories are really fun because they really were the first attempt at some kind of centralized identity management. They've been around for a long, long time. I said 25 years. Is that right?
X588.
Yeah, so they've been around for, yes?
About single login ID, maybe changing the login ID, for name change or something like that.
Changing the log ID for name change. It all depends on the value that you have. There should be no reason why you can't change your login ID with a name change. The industry's changing around identifiers right now. It used to be the old way was really Active Directory driven, which was first initial, last name was quite a common de facto standard for identifiers. But what's happening right now, because of multi-tenancy in the cloud, that de facto standard is actually changing to email address, right? Which also contains often a first initial and last name. But if you've done it right, if your login ID is loosely coupled to an internal identifier like an employee ID, then you should be able to do that, right? You should be able to change out your login ID and still have it resolved to an employee ID. However, it's not, that's actually one of the, identifier reuse and recycling and changing is a big deal. And it depends on how complex your applications are. If all you're pushing is a login ID, and you change that login ID at the source and you don't have an automated process to also change it in all of your other databases, that's when you get in trouble. So absolutely. Excellent question. Now, directories are one of the ways that identity management problems have been avoided for the last 2 decades. It is a common place where identity information can be stored, okay, that can be accessed by multiple applications. It can be used as an authentication store, and it's all available via a well-known standard called LDAP. Okay, so it doesn't give you, for example, single sign-on, but it means that if a user logs into 5 applications and each of those applications is using LDAP, they're at least typing the same password 5 times. So it's a heck of a lot better than having 5 separate application databases storing 5 separate passwords and containing 5 separate copies of attribute data. Anything else you guys want to say? So the evolution of directories is fascinating because did you guys hear that? He says he disagrees that directories are still interesting. So that's the commoditization.
Depends whether directories can handle XML properly.
Oh.
Sorry.
Yeah. So if we have time, we'll get into the argument of whether or not LDAP should be open to the internet. That's always entertaining. All right, so I'm going to keep going, try and jump to the next interesting thing. All right, so everything we've been talking about is, like I said, probably the most boring thing in identity, right? It's mapping things and understanding the relationships between all the data in your enterprise, right? So what comes next? Well, now we get to go and get stuff and move stuff and put stuff into places, right? So it gets slightly more interesting at this point. And that process of getting the right data into the right place to be used by your system applications is called provisioning. Okay, so I think 90% of you guys, if not more, are already doing some sort of provisioning based on that earlier survey. So, you know, the basics of provisioning are CRUD, right? You need to create, you need to replace, you need to update, and you need to delete users and accounts specifically from various systems in your organization, right? You don't have to do that with automation, right? You could have an army of administrators all accessing the administrative console of all your applications, right? Lots of small companies do this. But when they do it, they incur risk, right? Typos. Typos are the enemy of good identity management. All it takes is one mistyped name, one mistyped identifier, and everything breaks. So, you know, or for that matter, all it takes is one administrator not to get the memo that you have to remove a given user from a system because, you know, they've just been shown to be, you know, sabotaging the company, and you've all of a sudden introduced huge risk for your organization. So automation is really the only way that you can reliably know that things are going to change every single time you have an event in your organization. So, yes?
So another aspect of automation not reducing risk, though, is the scenario where...
Is your mic on?
No, it's not.
You should turn your mic on.
Oh,
There.
can you hear me now? Hello? There we go.
Oh, there we
Sorry
go.
about that. So there's the sort of the corollary risk of automating these processes, which is you need to have some idea that these processes run properly all the time. Because it's not unusual for some provisioning process to run wild and, for instance, delete all of the accounts that it wasn't supposed to delete. So automation by itself isn't the complete answer. It's automation with some policy around it that controls how far the automation can actually go.
Absolutely.
So as an example, if for some reason there's an error in the synchronization process, doesn't discover any accounts in Active Directory for some reason, you know, some failure, it shouldn't then go and delete all the accounts from all the applications that it's connected to. It should detect the fact that the number went from 10,000 to 0 and decide that it shouldn't do anything.
Right. Absolutely. So the other thing about provisioning is it's not pretty. There's no pretty in provisioning. Provisioning is, you know, schwacking attributes into an application in whatever possible way you can. And so there's a lot of choices as to how you get that information in. You could call an API. You could manipulate a back-end database, although that does not work in the cloud. And in fact, that is one of the greatest obstacles right now for any kind of automated provisioning in the industry. You can also do skim and just-in-time provisioning, which I'm going to talk about in a minute here. What's my time check? 18. All right. Good. Yes?
There were provisioning markup languages, SPML, for example. Could you give a brief thought as to how they did it and why they did what they did?
Yes, so I definitely can. So provisioning markup languages were basically a top-down way to try to bring some order to the world of provisioning.
Pam, why did you say past tense there?
I did use the word. They were. SPML is not a commonly used provisioning technique. It is, okay, who here is using SPML? Anyone?
there's one.
There, we got a couple. All right, so here's the thing about SPML. SPML is really useful when you, at the actual identity infrastructure level, because you can define policy and you can execute on that policy. So SPML, Service Provisioning Markup Language, you'll note I didn't even have it in there. And the reason I didn't have it in there is because the way that SPML evolved was that it went into the infrastructure products, but it was never ever picked up by the actual vendor, the actual application vendors. So you could create policies in your infrastructure, but they always had to be transformed to some other kind of fulfillment process at the back end, right? So you could execute a SPML plan, but it's going to result in a database change, or it's going to result in an API call, or it's going to result in something else. Would you?
Crap load of stuff you have to write yourself.
Yes. So actually, the funny thing is, Gil's got us some observations about some other markup languages that are very similar. It's big, it's involved. It tried to boil the ocean. So this is Hutch, by the way. You can wave to everybody. Yeah, he's lived it. I know you've lived it. Would you add anything else? I'll repeat it so everyone can hear it.
Well, I don't want to ruin it now because I can get away from it.
Yeah, I believe the paraphrase was run away.
No, Pam, the question I have about SPML, it went through several iterations. I think it ended up on SPML version 3 at some point, and nobody ever adopted it from version 1 or version 2 or version 3. What's not at all clear to me is why is SCIM any different? Okay, so it's cooler because it's not XML, so we know that's better, right? But other than that, it's semantically equivalent. So why as a vendor am I so compelled to pick up on SCIM when I didn't pick up on SPML? I don't think the fact that JSON is somehow more concise than XML is a real compelling reason, because I don't care about the bandwidth that much.
Right.
We've actually had this discussion a little bit. I don't think it's a compelling reason, but I think it's a sufficient reason that SCIM is cool. JSON is easier to deal with. There's fewer tools, and I think that may be all that it is.
Well, don't you think it's timing?
I think it's timing.
Timing.
SCIM has better marketing department.
SCIM, do you hear that? SCIM has a better marketing department, was the comment.
SCIM normalized what the large SaaS were already doing.
Yeah. Well, so I'm going to get into SCIM here. I have a few minutes, but I'd love to contrast it once I get there, because I actually think there's more to it than that. I think SPML was a language about the concept of defining anything you possibly wanted in a provisioning world, right? Provisioning anything. SCIM is about provisioning users and provisioning groups, right? So SPML, right, is this big, and SCIM is this big. And that could be problematic for SCIM, but this was problematic for SPML. So that would be my hypothesis for the question. But let me just go through these terms, because this is, I think, critical, right? There are really 3 base elements of a provisioning architecture. There's the process, right? The actual business ceremony that occurs that results in an event that's going to cause a provisioning change, okay? There's a trigger, okay? The trigger is not always the process specifically. So especially with Active Directory and directories, it could be that the process is an HR administrator going into their application, SAP, for example, and saying, this guy is so fired, right? That's the process. The actual trigger might be that when you submit that form, it writes to a directory, and the user is disabled. The actual status of the directory account changes, right? That actual directory change is the trigger in a lot of cases, right? So you've got a whole bunch of processes, or maybe a provisioning product sitting there watching, something changing, Active Directory change, okay, now I'm going to act, right? So there is a loose coupling often between the process and the actual trigger that's going to make all the data ripple through your organization. All right, so same map, right? Now we're going to talk a bit about processes, triggers, and fulfillment, right? So in this case, when you hire a user, you may in your HR system have, a process and a trigger, right, and fulfillment. But maybe for the rest of the ripple effect as data flows through your organization, there's no more process, just triggers, right, and fulfillments. So you should be able to describe the triggers and the fulfillment step for every single one of your target databases. We're going to go back to that one again. So a small moment of editorialization, because this comes back to the SPML question. Provisioning right now is messy. It's problematic. There's no good, simple, easy answer. Right now, there are vendors who do provisioning, and they do their best. What you're really paying for when you buy a provisioning solution is you're paying for them to shield you from the utter complete pain of trying to push all these accounts and attributes through systems, which is a great, it's a good business outcome. But wouldn't it be great if there was just a bit more cleanliness to the whole process? So right now, cloud application vendors, many cloud application vendors have no way to do automated provisioning, no way for you to call their service and create users on the fly programmatically, right? The default is an administration console. It's 100 administrators, each on their keys, each manually inputting customer information, or CSV bulk import, right? And that's a problem, right? You can basically, in my mind, tell the maturity of a cloud app by whether or not they have a provisioning API, right? Because you know that if they have a provisioning API, they've been talking to sophisticated customers who are trying to actually have some kind of consistency in their organization. So, that's my meter for who's got big customers and who doesn't, is whether or not they have a provisioning API. And my belief is that the best hope for the future is SCIM. So let's talk about SCIM. Now, there was a deep dive yesterday, so I'm not trying to deep dive on SCIM, but I do want to talk about why I think SCIM has a chance when SPIML didn't. The thing about SCIM is it sounds really fancy. It sounds like a protocol, and oh my gosh, isn't it great? It's not. It's just an API. What it is a design pattern for how you can have a RESTful API for identities. So what it publishes is an endpoint, right? A RESTful endpoint, right, which is your domain/users and one that's your domain/groups. And then you operate on that user's endpoint the same way you would for any other RESTful API. So if you do a create on the user's endpoint, you're going to create a user. If you do a delete on the actual user object, then it's going to delete that user.
So Pam, just one clarification. You said earlier that SCIM was just users and groups. It is extensible. You can do
it
things-
is extensible.
Right.
But
So it started with users and groups. They said just paving cow trails. They're just covering existing use cases, and so I completely agree with that, but I just wanted to make it clear it's also extensible to new types.
that's true. And clearly lots of applications have specific data they want to send. However, starting with a simple known endpoint and operating on that endpoint is a very, very different thing than starting with a language to describe anything and everything you might want to do if you ever wanted to provision anything to any service. So my sense is that this has a chance because they're starting small. So here's an example of a create, right? It's pretty human readable. You can actually see what's happening here, right? You're creating somebody. The external ID means that's the enterprise, right? The enterprise calls you B. Jensen, right? You may not be B. Jensen in the cloud app, right? So there's a loose coupling that occurs there. And here's some claims. You've got some family names, some given name, and you've got emails, right? You could have a whole bunch of different types of emails. So this schema is the second half of SCIM, right? There's the design pattern of the API, and then there's the stuff that you're going to post. And it's really simple JSON, which is why I like it. And here's what comes back. So you post, you say, hey, please create me Babs Jensen. What comes back is some confirmation of what exactly was going to be created and a location. So this location is unique to this user, right? This is a globally unique web identifier for this user that the enterprise can now use to operate on that single user. So you want to delete the user, you do a delete to that location, right? So it's not rocket science, and that's, I think that's important, right? And there's lots of details. There's always details in this thing, but ultimately, you tell it what your identifier is. It comes back and gives you a globally unique identifier, and then you kind of have a hook to hang your hat on, which is a big deal these days. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about, yes? Skim, so the question was, why doesn't Skim have password management? And the truth is, I can only give you a biased answer, okay? So I work for a company where we believe that passwords should never leave their authoritative source. So you talk about a single source of truth. You should have a single source of truth for your passwords. I don't know that that's why the Skim designers decided to do what they did. Passing passwords is fraught with problems. If you're going to synchronize passwords, what that means is one of two things. Either you have to keep a version of that password in a retrievable format, right, such as clear text, or you have to be able to actually know what the password is in order to pass it, or you have to share hashes, right? Those two things are problematic from a security perspective.
So one more comment here on this that Gil and I were just talking about because we're heckling you.
Good.
And this, I've only been familiar with it to the 1.1 version of the spec, so I don't know if this has changed in 2.0. Paul might, but there was provision, there was an allowance to set a password originally. There was no change password capability, but for creating an account, there was an allowance to be able to set the password in the first place. So there was a little bit of password capability in Skim, but they wanted to avoid it as much as possible for exactly what you said for the synchronization case.
Right, and bottom line is it's a best practice question, right? The best practice is keep your passwords at home, right? Keep them in whatever authoritative source that is, whether that's in the cloud or on-premise, it doesn't matter, but keep them there. And then use identity standards like SAML or OpenID Connect to reference them. And so send assertions instead of trying to verify passwords across everything. So just quickly talk about just-in-time provisioning. And just-in-time provisioning does work specifically with federation. So let's say you've got a database of customers, right? Let's say you've got a web portal and people are sort of signing up to see what's in your web portal. Okay, you don't necessarily know who's going to be there ahead of time, right? You only know that when somebody shows up at your front door and wants to look at your marketing portal, you really want to let them in. So what just-in-time provisioning will let you do is it essentially lets you create a channel, right? You can create a high-level corporate relationship with an identity provider, right? Maybe a partner or somebody like that. And you basically say, anyone who wants to authenticate, they can just send an assertion over. And when that assertion arrives, you read the assertion, you parse the assertion, and you use it to create the account in real time. So literally their account didn't exist until the first time they tried to authenticate, and then an account was created for you. All right, so this is really what we're talking about, right? I'm finished. I have to finish up now, but this is really where we want to get, right? You have a single provisioning system that sits in the middle that figures out the mess, figures out how the heck it's going to get all these identities and accounts into all these systems. It's also the single place where you run your policy. And we're getting into authorization here, and I want to leave you with this idea, right, that it's messy. Your solutions are really going to fix it for you as much as it can be fixed. But what matters is you have to preserve the state of how all of these attributes sit and what their relationships are to their authoritative source. All right, so we'll move along. We'll do some questions, and Dale, if you want to get set up. Oh,
I have a question. So is anybody suspicious of the notion of the one true provisioning system at the middle of everything?
I said these were basic recipes. Yeah, it's true. But lots of companies won't have something this simplistic, right? For example, a lot of companies will have something that sits on-premise and does all the on-premise really messy stuff, and then they might have a gateway that's a Skim gateway that will have, where the cloud gateway will actually make SCIM or proprietary provisioning API calls out to the cloud. So there is no reason it has to be one. That's just the simple, that's the motherhood and apple pie version of provisioning, if you will. What else?
It sounded like SCIM is an interchange protocol format, whatever you want to call it, but I was kind of confused by the password discussion because if you've got your account creation application, you're not going to use SCIM as a password.
So the only time the password works in SCIM is if you do it on a create. So essentially what you're saying is I want to provision a user via the SCIM interface, and I'm going to give them an initial password, and then after that, they're going to have to go negotiate their password with the actual application itself.
An application talking to the directory or whatever, that doesn't use SCIM.
That's right. That's right. And the most common design pattern is you would make your API call with SCIM to create the user, and then the user would authenticate with some kind of federated identity. Yes?
Let me try to shout out. And I just want to give you a viewpoint of data provisioning through identity management systems versus the data synchronization through some configuration service with data aggregation activity.
Yes. So the question was sort of general provisioning versus synchronization, right? I think the canonical example of this, are you almost ready to go, Dale? I don't want to run over Dale's spot, but the most common, the biggest example I think most people would be familiar with is Office 365, right? So in Office 365, they have something called DirSync. And DirSync is basically a big fat pipe that links your Active Directory on-prem to a representation of that same data in the cloud. Okay, so that it's synchronization, it's a much stricter version of synchronization. When you think of the provisioning that you can do here, there's transformation that can be involved, right? So you can, when you push a new user into a new system, you can change the date format, you can change the name format. When it's synchronization, it's a mirror copy, right? And it's much more transactional in its relationship. So I consider synchronization to be a subset of provisioning, and really it just becomes an application-specific integration technique between your Active Directory and whatever that source is. So I don't know, would you agree with me?
Well, I think something is true in old school, but in the new world, we've seen a vendor come up
Yeah.
with one-to-one virtual offering that has a lot of data capability, data aggregation, correlation, root clean data. It's almost acts as a provision system now with its own workflow.
Right.
So it's different market, I believe. It has also overlapping with old school identity.
Yeah, I would agree. So what she was saying is that, that new products are coming up right now that really blur those lines, right? Where you can apply policy and it isn't just a blunt force synchronization. And really where that gets to is the idea, if you have a cloud directory and you have an on-premise directory, right? To keep those things tightly in sync and then have all the applications refer to those cloud directories, right? Synchronization can work between those two directories that are then leveraged out to all sorts of applications. So does that do that justice?
Yes, I think we're going to have more discussion on that.
I think we should talk more, but we'll let Dale get on his, and then we'll do that after. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody, and we'll get Dale Olds up now to talk about authentication.